I thought I was just a stay-at-home mom living a perfect life until I overheard my husband bragging about his organized scheme to discard me like trash. But he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the woman he had spent a decade trying to erase. I remember the lighting in that restaurant perfectly. It was dim, intimate, and specifically designed to make people feel like they were the only ones in the room. I was sitting in the corner booth, hidden behind a tall, leafy fern, nursing a glass of lukewarm white wine that I hadn't even wanted. I was waiting for my sister, Sarah, to finish her shift so we could grab a late dinner, but she was running behind. I pulled out my phone, intending to scroll through social media, when the sound of a familiar, booming laugh stopped me cold. It was Mark, my husband. The man who had left our house 3 hours ago claiming he had a critical board meeting that would likely last until the early hours of the morning. He wasn't alone. He was sitting at the center table with 2 of his business associates, men I'd hosted for dinner a dozen times, and a woman I didn't recognize. She was young, her hair perfectly blown out, wearing a dress that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. She was laughing at something Mark said, leaning in close, her hand resting delicately on his forearm. I froze. I should have stood up. I should have walked over there, poured the wine over his perfectly coiffed hair, and made a scene that would be talked about in this town for years. But my body wouldn't obey. I felt heavy, anchored to the velvet seat by a sudden, sickening weight of betrayal. I sank lower, my pulse drumming in my ears, and listened. I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't move. "So, Mark," one of the associates chuckled, swirling his scotch, "I didn't see Elena at the charity gala last night. I thought she never missed a chance to show off her charity work." Mark leaned back, a smug, dismissive smirk playing on his lips, a look I hadn't seen directed at me, but one I recognized instantly. "Elena?" he scoffed, loud enough for the table next to them to hear. "Who needs her, honestly? She's just a stay-at-home mom now. She's completely let herself go. You know how it is. Once they stop working, they stop trying. She's turned into a couch potato, obsessed with the kids and her garden. It's pathetic, really." The young woman at the table giggled, a hollow, sharp sound that pierced through me. "Does she know you're out?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial innocence. "She doesn't know anything," Mark laughed, taking a long, slow sip of his drink. "She's probably sitting in her robe right now, folding laundry or reading bedtime stories. She has no idea what's actually going on in my life. And frankly, she's so checked out, she wouldn't even notice if I moved out tomorrow. I keep her around because it's convenient, but let's be real, she's just background noise, a decoration that's lost its shine." My hands were shaking so violently that I had to place them under the table. Every word he spoke was like a serrated blade, cutting through the years of devotion, the late nights I spent helping him write his business reports, the times I covered for his absences when he was working late, and the sacrifices I'd made to keep our life appearing perfect while he slowly drained the joy out of everything. I looked down at myself. I was wearing an oversized sweater and jeans, just as he had described. I had been planning to surprise him with a late-night treat, to show him that I cared, to mend the distance that had been growing between us for months. I thought he was stressed. I thought he was overwhelmed. I didn't realize he was actively erasing me from his world. "She's just background noise," he repeated, clearly loving the sound of his own cruelty. "I've got bigger things coming anyway. Soon I'll be rid of the domestic dead weight entirely. I've already moved the assets into a separate account. Once the house sells, I'm gone. She won't even see it coming." My vision blurred. Assets. The house. Moved. He wasn't just cheating. He was systematically dismantling my entire existence while I was busy trying to keep our family afloat. I realized then that my perfect life was a cage, and the lock had been changed while I wasn't looking. I knew I had to get out of there, to go home and plan my next move, but as I started to slide out of the booth, the restaurant door swung open. A group of men in dark, sharp suits walked in, their movements synchronized and cold. They didn't look like diners. They scanned the room with the precision of a hunting party, and their eyes landed squarely on Mark's table. One of the men stepped forward, reaching into his jacket. Mark looked up, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of sudden, paralyzing terror. The associates at the table stood up, backing away as if they realized they were suddenly in the middle of a war zone. "Mark Thompson?" the lead man asked, his voice cutting through the ambient music of the restaurant like a gunshot. "We're from the internal department of the firm. We've been conducting a long-term investigation into your department's finances. It seems you've been involved in a complex, organized scheme to embezzle funds through shell companies. We also have information regarding some illegal shipments you've been facilitating." Mark's face went ash gray. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. "We have evidence of illegal substance distribution and involvement in an organized network," the man continued, gesturing to his colleagues. "You are facing a massive investigation that will lead to a heavy sentence. This isn't a simple audit, Mark. This is a life-altering charge." The restaurant went dead silent. The young woman beside him stood up, clutching her bag, looking like she wanted to evaporate into the floorboards. I sat in the shadows of the fern, my breath caught in my throat, watching as the man who had just called me background noise was suddenly forced to his knees. The handcuffs clicked, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the room. He looked toward the entrance, his eyes pleading, desperate, looking for someone, anyone, to help him. Then he turned his head, scanning the room, and his eyes locked onto mine through the gaps in the fern. He stopped moving. He knew. And in that moment, as the realization of his ruined future hit him, he saw something in my expression that made him go pale. I wasn't crying, I wasn't scared, I was smiling. The silence in the restaurant was thick enough to choke on. The patrons, usually buzzing with the clinking of glasses and soft jazz, were now statues, their forks hovering mid-air. I didn't move. I didn't pull my hand back. I simply held his gaze, my smile fixed and unnervingly calm. It was the smile of a woman who had just realized that her cage door had been left swinging wide open, and the person who had locked it was now the one being dragged toward a future of prison bars and ruined reputations. Mark's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Confusion, recognition, and finally, a raw, desperate fear. He knew exactly what that look on my face meant. It meant that I knew. It meant that I had seen the evidence of his arrogance, and more importantly, it meant that I was no longer the stay-at-home pushover he thought he could discard like yesterday's trash. One of the men from the internal security team gripped Mark's arm, yanking him up from the floor. "Mr. Thompson, you are being detained for internal review and interrogation. Do not make this more difficult than it already has to be." "Elena," Mark hissed, his voice cracking with panic as they began to haul him toward the exit. "Elena, wait. Listen to me. It's not what it looks like. Tell them. Tell them I've been a good husband. Tell them this is a mistake." I stood up slowly. I adjusted my coat, smoothed the wrinkles in my sweater, and walked out from behind the fern with the deliberate pace of a queen. The entire room turned to look at me. The young woman he had been with was huddled in the corner, looking at me with a mixture of terror and curiosity, clearly realizing that she had been playing with fire and had just been burned. I stopped right in front of him. The security agents paused, sensing the tension. Mark's eyes were bloodshot, pleading. He was frantic, his clothes disheveled, his dignity stripped away by the very labels the agents were throwing at him, the organized scheme, the forbidden substances, the heavy charges. "Tell them?" I asked, my voice cool, steady, and loud enough for everyone at the nearby tables to hear. "Tell them what, Mark? That you've been spending our savings on someone who clearly isn't me? That you've been running some shadow operation while I was at home raising our children?" "I can explain," he stammered, his bravado completely disintegrated. "It's a misunderstanding. I was set up. Please, you have to help me. They're going to give me an enormous sentence for these accusations. You're my wife. You're supposed to stand by me." I leaned in close, so close I could smell the expensive cologne he'd worn to impress his mistress, mixed now with the metallic scent of sweat and fear. A wife stands by her husband when he's down on his luck, Mark. But a wife doesn't stand by a man who has been systematically dismantling her life, plotting to throw her out with nothing, and calling her domestic dead weight while he sits in a booth with a woman who probably doesn't even know your middle name. His eyes widened. He knew I had heard it all. He knew the background noise had been listening to every single word. You heard?" he whispered. "I heard every word," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice water on his skin. "I heard about the separate accounts. I heard about the house. And do you know what's funny? While you were busy playing the part of the big shot executive with his little side projects, you got sloppy. You left your laptop open. You left those documents in the home office. You thought I was too busy with laundry and gardening to notice the patterns. But you forget one thing, Mark. I was the one who managed your accounts for the first 5 years of our marriage. I know where the bodies are buried, and I think the internal team is going to be very interested in the encrypted folders I moved to a secure cloud server this morning." Mark's jaw dropped. The color drained from his face until he was ghost white. The agent holding his arm gave a sharp tug. "Let's go, now." As they began to drag him toward the glass doors of the restaurant, Mark turned back, his expression shifting from fear to pure, unadulterated rage. "You bitch! You think you're safe? You think they'll just let you go? If I go down, you're going down with me? You've benefited from the lifestyle. You're part of the organized network in their eyes." I didn't flinch. I just stood there, watching him get shoved into the back of a black SUV parked at the curb. The young woman from his table finally gathered the courage to bolt for the door, fleeing the scene and leaving her designer handbag behind. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold night air hitting my face, feeling more alive than I had in a decade. I checked my watch, 10:45 p.m. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had been avoiding for years, a number that belonged to a high-powered divorce attorney who specialized in scorched earth litigation. "He's on his way to the detention facility," I said calmly when the lawyer answered. "It's time to start the paperwork. Take everything." "Everything?" the lawyer asked, his voice sharp and intrigued. "Elena, you know the complications with these accusations. If you go after the assets, the internal investigators might—" "They won't," I interrupted, "because I'm not just the spouse, I'm the whistleblower." I hung up, feeling a surge of adrenaline. I turned to walk to my car, but a figure stepped out from behind a pillar in the shadows. It was the lead agent who had detained Mark. He wasn't looking at the SUV. He was looking directly at me. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "we need to talk about those files you mentioned, the ones you moved to the cloud." I froze. He hadn't left with Mark. He had stayed behind to wait for me. "I told you," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'm a victim here. I'm a stay-at-home mom." He stepped into the light, and for the first time, I saw the badge clipped to his belt. It wasn't just a corporate security badge. It was something else, something much more dangerous. He reached into his coat, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I thought he was going to pull out handcuffs, but instead, he pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope. "We know who you are, Elena," he said, handing me the envelope, "and we know why you really did it. But there's a problem. Mark didn't act alone. He was just the front. The people he was working for, they aren't going to be happy that their background noise just became the most important witness in the country, and they're watching you right now." He leaned in, his eyes darting to a black sedan idling at the end of the block, its headlights suddenly clicking on. "If you want to live to see the end of this trial, you're going to have to run." The world seemed to compress into a singular point of focus, the blinding headlights of the sedan at the end of the block. I didn't think. I moved. I snatched the envelope from the agent's hand, my fingers brushing his cold, calloused palm. He didn't offer a goodbye or a word of comfort. He simply turned and vanished into the darkness of an alleyway, leaving me standing on the sidewalk like a beacon in the night. "Get in the car," a voice hissed from behind me. I spun around, ready to scream, but stopped when I saw Sarah, my sister, gripping the door handle of her battered hatchback. She had arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, having seen the commotion from the parking lot. I lunged for the passenger door, and as I dived inside, the black sedan at the end of the street screeched forward, its engine roaring like a wounded animal. "Drive, Sarah, just drive!" I shouted, slamming the door shut. Sarah didn't ask questions. She knew the look of pure terror on my face. She peeled out of the parking spot, the tires squealing against the asphalt. I looked back through the rear window. The sedan was gaining, weaving through traffic with a reckless disregard for the red lights. They weren't just following us, they were hunting us. "Who are they?" Sarah gasped, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Elena, what the hell is happening? Mark's company put out a notice saying he was being questioned for serious financial violations, and now you're telling me people are trying to run us off the road." "Mark wasn't just skimming off the top," I said, my voice barely audible over the thumping of my own heart. I ripped open the envelope. Inside weren't just legal documents. They were photos, dozens of them, showing Mark meeting with figures I recognized from the evening news as key players in a massive, dangerous network. There were ledgers detailing the movement of prohibited substances and manifests for illegal weapons being moved across state lines under the guise of shipping containers. My stomach dropped. I hadn't just accidentally stumbled upon a white-collar crime. I had uncovered a massive, violent scheme that reached into the darkest corners of the city. Mark wasn't the mastermind, he was the fall guy. He was the ledger keeper who knew too much. And now, I was the one who held the proof. "I need to get to the federal building," I whispered, clutching the photos to my chest. "If I can get these to the regional headquarters, I can cut a deal. I can protect us." "The regional headquarters?" Sarah shouted, swerving hard to avoid a delivery truck. "Elena, they're everywhere. You think they don't have eyes in the police force or the building security? You're walking into a lion's den." "I have no choice," I yelled back. "If I go home, they'll kill me. If I go to the police, they'll bury it. This is the only way." The sedan behind us suddenly surged, pulling up alongside us. I could see the silhouette of a man in the passenger seat, his arm extending out the window. My pulse spiked. I saw the glint of steel, a cold, menacing object that looked like a high-powered firearm, catching the light of a street lamp. "Get down!" I screamed, tackling Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the center console. The hatchback swerved violently as Sarah lost her grip on the wheel. We hit the curb with a bone-jarring thud, the car bouncing into the air before slamming back down. I heard the pop, pop, pop of metal piercing the rear window. Glass shattered, raining down on us like diamonds. The sedan didn't stop. It clipped our rear bumper, sending us into a tailspin. Everything turned into a blur of spinning lights, screeching metal, and the smell of burning rubber. We slammed into a stack of shipping crates near the docks, the impact knocking the breath out of my lungs and plunging the car into absolute darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the idling sedan engine nearby and the rhythmic clicking of my car's cooling radiator. I couldn't move. My head throbbed, and a warm, sticky sensation trickled down my forehead. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice sounding hollow. There was no answer. The door of the sedan slammed shut. Boots crunched on the gravel outside, getting closer with every agonizing second. I reached for the envelope, but my fingers couldn't find it. I felt around the floorboards, frantic and desperate, until my hand brushed against a jagged piece of glass and the cold, smooth edge of an envelope lying under the driver's seat. I grabbed it just as a heavy, gloved hand reached through our broken window and ripped the door lock open. A beam of blinding light hit my face, forcing me to shield my eyes. "Found her," a deep, gravelly voice said. I braced myself for the end, holding my breath, my entire life flashing before me. But as the man reached in to grab me, a sudden deafening explosion ripped through the air, not from a gun but from the dockside itself. A siren began to wail, and the blinding light was suddenly joined by a dozen other beams cutting through the night. "Federal agents, drop the weapon! Get on the ground now!" The man holding my door froze. He looked toward the approaching lights, then back at me. He didn't drop his weapon. Instead, he grabbed my collar and yanked me out of the wreck, pressing the cold barrel of his gun against my temple. "Don't move," he snarled to the darkness, "or the witness dies right now." I was held captive, my back against the mangled metal of the car, staring into the abyss of the tactical teams surrounding us. Just then, I saw him. A man in a crisp suit stepping out from behind a concrete pillar. It was the lead agent from the restaurant. He wasn't holding a badge. He was holding a detonator. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and devoid of pity. "And you, Elena, you were never the witness. You were the decoy." The world seemed to stop spinning, leaving me gasping for air against the cold, jagged metal of the wrecked car. The agent, the man I thought was my lifeline, stood there, his face an unreadable mask of clinical detachment. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at me like an equation that had finally been solved. "Decoy," I rasped, the word tasting like copper and ash. My mind was reeling, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of the last hour. "You said you were with internal security. You said—" "I am," he interrupted, his voice calm, cutting through the chaos like a razor. "Internal security for the agency. But the agency isn't what you think it is, Elena. Mark wasn't the lead. He was the ledger. He was the one who kept the books for a network that spans across sectors. We didn't need you to bring down the network. We needed you to draw out the cleaners, the ones who are currently standing behind the tactical teams, masquerading as law enforcement." He looked toward the perimeter of the docks, where the federal agents had just arrived. They were moving with a precision that didn't belong to any standard police force. They were silent, efficient, and as I watched closely, I realized they weren't aiming at the gunman holding me. They were aiming at him. The man holding the gun to my head chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You've been played, sweetheart, both of you." Before I could process the gravity of his words, a muffled thwip sound echoed through the pier. The gunman holding me suddenly stiffened. A small black dart protruded from his neck. He tried to pull the trigger, his finger twitching, but his body went limp, his grip on my collar failing as he slumped to the ground unconscious. I scrambled away, my breath hitching in my chest, and crawled toward the shelter of a rusted shipping container. I watched in horror as the tactical teams I had prayed would save me suddenly opened fire. Not on the criminals, but on the lead agent. He ducked behind a pillar, returning fire with a precision that was terrifying to behold. This wasn't a rescue. This was an internal war, and I was caught directly in the crossfire. "Stay down!" Sarah screamed from inside the car, her voice cracking as she leaned out of the shattered window. "Elena, get inside!" "I can't!" I shouted back, clutching the envelope to my chest. I looked at the papers inside. They weren't just evidence of illegal activity, they were lists. Names, addresses, dates, and most chillingly, a file labeled Project Sunset, with my name at the top. I flipped the page, my eyes widening. There was a photo of me, not from my current life, but from years ago before I ever met Mark. It was me, standing outside a different building, in a city I hadn't visited in a decade. I wasn't a stay-at-home mom by accident. I was a target. My marriage, my boring life, my children, it had all been a carefully constructed shell, a witness protection program that I had somehow erased from my own memory. The realization hit me harder than the car crash. Every forgetfulness, every time I felt like a stranger in my own home, the gaps in my childhood that I always assumed were just trauma. It wasn't just my imagination. I was an asset that had been shelved and forgotten. A shadow fell over me. I looked up to see the lead agent standing over me, his suit torn, blood trickling down his forehead. He wasn't pointing his weapon at me, he was holding out a hand. "They didn't tell you, did they?" he said, his voice softer now. "The agency, the life you've been living. They didn't give you a new start, Elena. They gave you a cage, and they put Mark there to make sure you never looked at the bars. He wasn't your husband, he was your handler." My entire body went cold. "No, that's a lie. He loved me. He had kids with me." "He had orders," the agent replied, glancing nervously at the approaching soldiers. "And he just broke them by failing to keep you contained. Now, they're coming to sanitize the entire site. If you want to know who you really are and why they're willing to burn this entire port to keep you quiet, you need to choose right now. Do you trust the man who spent 10 years lying to you, or do you come with me?" The ground shook as an explosion detonated near the entrance of the pier, throwing sparks into the night sky. The tactical teams were closing in, their tactical lights scanning the darkness, searching for me. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the wreckage. "Elena, don't listen to him. We don't know who he is either. We have to run now." I looked at the agent, then back at the envelope in my hands. The name at the top of the Project Sunset file wasn't Elena Thompson. It was a name I didn't recognize, a name that felt like a secret key waiting to turn a lock in my mind. "Who am I?" I asked, my voice trembling. The agent looked at me, a flicker of something like regret in his eyes. "You're the only person who knows how to open the vault that could destroy this entire organized network. And the people coming for us, they aren't going to capture you, Elena. They're here to erase you." A red laser dot appeared on the agent's chest. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at me and said, "Run." Just as he pushed me toward the shadows of the containers, the air filled with the deafening roar of a helicopter hovering overhead. A spotlight swept down, blinding us, and a voice boomed from the sky. "Target acquired. Initiate containment protocol." I turned to run, but Sarah shrieked. A figure had stepped out from the darkness ahead of us, blocking our only exit. It wasn't one of the soldiers. It was Mark. He wasn't handcuffed anymore. He was holding a weapon, and his face was twisted into a mask of cold, calculated indifference. "I told you, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You were never supposed to know. Now, I have to finish the job I started 10 years ago." Mark stepped into the harsh glare of the helicopter spotlight, the weapon in his hand held with a terrifying, practiced ease. The man who had once complained about my garden and my choice of curtains was gone. In his place stood a predator who had spent a decade playing the role of a doting husband to keep me neutralized. "It was never a marriage, Elena," Mark said, his voice cold, devoid of the petty annoyance he'd feigned in the restaurant. "It was an assignment, a long-term containment mission. You were the repository for the encryption keys, and my job was to ensure you never remembered the access code. But you had to go and get curious, didn't you? You had to dig into the accounts." I felt Sarah's hand tremble in mine. I looked at the file, the one labeled Project Sunset. My thumb brushed the edge of the paper, and suddenly a phantom memory flickered in my mind. A string of numbers, complex and rhythmic, floating in the dark. It wasn't just data. It was a signature. My signature. "I remember," I whispered, the words coming out stronger than I expected. "I remember the vault. I remember why you're really here." Mark's eyes narrowed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then you know there's no way out." Before he could fire, the lead agent, the one who had handed me the envelope, lunged from the shadows behind a stack of crates. He didn't aim at Mark. He fired a signal flare directly into the center of the helicopter's spotlight. The brilliant, searing magnesium light blinded everyone, turning the pier into a whiteout of chaos. "Run, Elena!" the agent shouted. I didn't think twice. I pulled Sarah toward the edge of the dock, where the dark, churning water waited. We didn't jump. We dived, plunging into the freezing depths just as a volley of suppressed gunfire chewed through the wooden pier where we had been standing seconds before. We surfaced under the pylons, gasping for air. Above us, the pier was erupting in a tactical frenzy. The federal agents and Mark's team were tearing each other apart, their masks slipping to reveal they were all part of the same corrupt, sprawling network. They weren't fighting for justice. They were fighting for control of the information I held. "We can't get back to land," Sarah whispered, her teeth chattering. "They'll be waiting at every exit." "They won't," I said, my voice steady. The fog in my mind had cleared completely. I remembered the signal I had set up years ago, a fail-safe triggered by a specific GPS location. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small, waterproof satellite beacon I had carried for years, never knowing what it was for until that very moment. I pressed the single button. A minute later, the sound of a silent, high-speed drone hummed above us. It wasn't from the agency. It was from the only people I had trusted before my memory was wiped. A private, independent oversight committee that had been searching for me since the day I disappeared. As the drone dropped a ladder, a massive blast echoed from the pier. The entire structure collapsed, burying the network soldiers and Mark's team under tons of concrete and steel. The evidence, the files, the ledgers, the proof of their organized scheme and their illicit shipments, was gone. But they didn't know the truth. The vault wasn't in the files. It was in my head. We climbed into the extraction craft, the pilot pulling us away from the inferno of the docks. I looked back one last time. Mark was crawling out of the rubble, his face a mask of defeat as the real authorities, the actual, uncorrupted internal security, descended upon the site to secure what remained of the evidence. 3 months later, I sat on a porch overlooking a quiet coastline, thousands of miles away from the life I once knew. Sarah was there, tending to a real garden, not the one Mark had mocked, but one that was truly ours. My memory had returned in fragments, then in a flood. I wasn't just an asset. I was a whistleblower who had been erased, and now I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. The network was dismantled. The heavy sentences were being handed down daily, and Mark, the man who had lived in my house, eaten at my table, and called me background noise, was spending his remaining years in a cage of his own making, far away from the influence he had once craved. He had tried to discard me like a piece of garbage, but in doing so, he had stripped away the only thing keeping me hidden. I pulled out a small piece of paper, the last remaining document from the Project Sunset file. I didn't need it anymore. I struck a match and watched the paper turn to ash, the flame dancing in the cool ocean breeze. I had lost a decade of my life, but I had gained something far more valuable: the truth. I wasn't a stay-at-home mom. I wasn't a victim. I was the person who brought down a global criminal syndicate, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly, in control of my own story. I took a deep breath of the salt air, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence. It wasn't the silence of someone afraid to speak. It was the peaceful, powerful silence of a woman who had survived the storm and come out the other side entirely whole. I was no longer background noise. I was the voice that had changed everything.